I mean, the fundamental thing is that block building has a direct impact on that market structure, right? So you can imagine like Jito packs blocks a certain way, Harmonic packs blocks in a completely different manner. And then you have to ask yourself not just which approach is better, but like how can market makers deal with this inconsistency where in one slot you're dealing with Jito client blocks, and then in the other slot you're dealing with like harmonic blocks. And so it is really complicated for the market makers, users, and applications to actually have like an optimal market structure when you have so many inconsistencies, basically.
Hey guys, Blockworks Digital Asset Summit is going to be back in New York City, March 24th through the 26th. We're going to have top speakers from leading asset managers, financial institutions, DeFi protocols, crypto companies, policymakers, you name it, everybody all under one roof. Think BlackRock, the SEC, Tether, Robinhood, Solana, and much, much more. Follow the link in today's show notes to get your tickets, and you can use code Lightspeed200 for $200 off at checkout. Nothing said on Lightspeed is a recommendation to buy or sell any investments or products. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and the views expressed by anyone on the show are solely their opinions, not financial advice or necessarily the views of Blockworks. Our hosts, guests, and the Blockworks team may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Lightspeed podcast. For this week's roundup today, I am joined by Carlos, as per usual. We saw him last week, he's back again, but also a new face to the pod and to probably Blockworks pods in general, Sam Schubert from the research team. Glad to have you guys on, and Sam, for your first time, I think, on a Blockworks pod, glad to have you on as well. How you guys doing today?
Doing great. How about you guys?
Yeah, doing very well. Long time listener, so appreciate being on the pod.
Love to hear that. Definitely appreciate it. I know there's a little bit of Blockworks folks listen to Blockworks pods. Maybe it's a little bit of expected, but it's always nice to hear. Before we jump into today, I know both of you guys will be at DAS in New York. I'll be there as well. So the full crew today will be at DAS New York. Coming up in just a month now, basically a month. What's today? The 16th as of this recording. So March 24th through the 26th. Going to be in NYC. You can get your tickets, get $200 off. Use Lightspeed 200 to get $200 off tickets, and you can see any of the great gentlemen on your screen here today, or listening if you're just a listener. The sounds that they make in your ears, I guess, today at the conference. We'd love to chat with you guys, viewers out there. So come see us at DAS. It's going to be pretty stacked. Probably the most stacked conference I think that Blockworks has ever had. Shout out to Bennett and the events team. They're killing it, but names like Tether, Binance, pick your favorite sort of like crypto names, and then also the CFTC, the SEC, regulators, Fed Reserve chairman members, TradFi institutions, BlackRock, etc. So just going to be super stacked. If you're interested at all, what's going on with sort of the institutionalization of the industry, it should be a really awesome conference. So we'd love to see you guys there. Lightspeed 200. Come out and see us. Come chat with Sam. Come chat with Carlos, especially if you like what they chat about today. So it should be pretty fun. Jumping on from DAS. The reason I wanted to have you guys both on today is by the time this episode goes out, the report should already be public, or at least out there, available for folks to read about block building. But that report will be posted on the Solana Lightspeed IR platform that is going live Tuesday, which will now have also passed by the time this episode's out. Maybe we can chat a little bit about that, Carlos. We've not covered it too much other than maybe a few months ago saying, hey, we're going to do a fun Lightspeed IR platform for Solana stuff at some point in the future, but haven't had a lot of details to share here yet. I know that there'll be a lot of Solana specific content on that platform. I guess, can you speak to the sort of the variety and breadth of content that'll be available and what Lightspeed is kind of offering?
Yeah, sure. So David had an announcement last week from our team at Hong Kong. Lightspeed can be viewed, in my opinion, as a hub for Solana-focused investor relations. So in terms of content, what you can expect is just like monthly updates on the Solana ecosystem, quarterly reports, not just on Solana itself, but on like the various sectors that encompass the DeFi ecosystem. So think about like DEX quarterly reports, lending landscape quarterly reports. We also do deep dives on projects specifically. So think about like deep dive on pump or like deep dives on specific topics. So like tokenized equities would be one example. All obviously focused on the Solana ecosystem, but always objective and maintaining this sort of like research grade lens, if that makes any sense. So yeah, it's going live tomorrow. By the time this episode goes live, I think it's going to be uh, like Tuesday, February 17. I don't know when this episode is going to be live, but yeah. And then the big piece that's going to accompany the launch is going to be Solana block building, which is the piece we're going to discuss today, which is a really, really important topic, probably the most important topic for Solana today.
Yeah, great coverage there. And just to round out the Lightspeed conversation, Blockworks Advisory we've got kind of two recent additions to that team, Toma and Joe, who have not been on this show yet, but hopefully can get them on at some point. They'll be doing some writing for that platform, consistently putting out content on things within the Solana ecosystem, specific topics. So should be great sort of additional coverage that maybe we can chat with them here on the show on Lightspeed and kind of get their takes and views on what's going on. But to Carlos's point, block building, we have been talking about this past couple of weeks. Last week, I think we talked a little bit about kind of the stake distribution and sort of validator client distribution on Solana. The big sort of conversation is this. I mean, there is kind of like this feud and this battle going on right now between Jito and Harmonic, relatively publicly, I would say, on X. There's been some back and forth about. So maybe just to go over some of the things we've covered in the past is Jito released their IBRL dashboard that kind of they were talking quite heavily about how blocks are packed and the sort of consequences of some validators are packing all of their blocks late and the downstream impacts of that. And then Harmonic has kind of had, or Temporal and Harmonic, they've sort of had their own responses around, why their design is, potentially not negative, or that, they're market-based actors and they're just building systems that the market is willing to take on. And they've kind of released some of their own data to showcase that. I think it's a great opportunity for us to jump in today based on the research you guys did, Sam and Carlos. And Sam, certainly glad we could have you on because definitely a smart guy from the research team that we haven't gotten to showcase, I guess, publicly on the podcast yet. So this should be fun. But maybe if either one of you, maybe Sam, if you can level set me on just sort of lay the foundation of where you started in kind of this, investigation into block building and where that takes us.
Yeah, sounds good. So I guess this all initially started when looking at like competitive dynamics relative to Solana. So obviously we've seen Hyperliquid success, and they've come from essentially a relatively much more centralized point of view in order to get the correct microstructure working. And that has seen them essentially lead the way with perps, whereas Solana has essentially come from the other end. And as we've seen over the last 1 year, 2 years, perps has never really taken off on Solana per se. So I guess it makes you ask the fundamental question, like, why hasn't this happened? And in my opinion, and I believe the Blockworks research opinion, is a lot of this is to do with microstructure. And you can relate to things such as block building and essentially how the whole process is pretty fragmented. And we haven't been able to achieve the correct microstructure in order to get the tighter spreads and the best environment for applications to actually succeed. So that's kind of how the idea started, and we've led from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the fundamental thing is that block building has a direct impact on that market structure, right? So you can imagine like Jito packs blocks a certain way, Harmonic packs blocks in a completely different manner. And then you have to ask yourself not just which approach is better, but like how can market makers deal with this inconsistency where in one slot you're dealing with Jito like Jito client blocks, and then in the other slot you're dealing with like Harmonic blocks, and then in the other slot you're dealing with Franken Dancer. And so it is really complicated for the market makers, users and applications to actually have like an optimal market structure when you have so many inconsistencies, basically.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think talking about maybe the stake breakdown or the client breakdown maybe tease up the conversation. So obviously part of the tension here is that there's competition over market share for that client and that stake, or client usage of their client, and then therefore the stake associated with either or client. And we've seen some changes here. I'll just add this data that you guys have available in the report on validator clients. But I guess talk to me through like the changing landscape here, and downstream of that, like what that leads us to think. Obviously, Jito's been changing from kind of their older client to now Jito BAM, and then Harmonic has kind of come up out of nowhere, I guess, if you want to call it that. They're relatively recent to the scene. So how have things been shifting, and where are we going?
Yeah, I'd say so for a long time, obviously Jito has had essentially a monopoly on the validator clients. And going on what I said previously, they've introduced Jito BAM, and essentially now they have essentially incentives in place in order to get more validators to adopt the Jito BAM client. And these incentives are in place essentially because these validators would be foregoing near-term revenue. But the argument is we're trying to grow the pie, and that's Jito essentially being a good steward of the network is trying to do that any way possible. And leading into this, and also the release of the IBRL dashboard, is when we saw Harmonic essentially start to gain market share late last year, and now I believe there's around 10 to 15% of share at the moment. So now we're seeing this controversy between essentially arguments on the best way to run the block building landscape, with Jito BAM on the rise as well as Harmonic.
And so going from there, I guess let's talk through specifically, we know there's this kind of battle, he said, she said, we think our architecture is better. They think their architecture is better. And trying to build a viewpoint around that. Maybe take either side here, like an overview of Harmonic or an overview of Jito BAM, and kind of what that leads us to think about the trade-offs here.
Yeah, so I can speak to the Jito BAM side. So the basic idea with Jito BAM is, maybe we can show the slides here. I think that would be way easier. So yeah, so BAM has like a network of nodes that keeps transaction ordering private until execution via TEEs. And the idea is that will limit negative behavior that mitigates MEV. So as you can see here, when a user sends that transaction, that goes into a TE. That the idea with that is to keep like this pre-trade privacy, so that no one can pick off the market maker. And then you kind of submit an attestation to make sure that the ordering is correct. The default ordering under Jito BAM is by priority fee and CU. So that functions very similarly to what we have today on Solana and what MCP, which is multiple concurrent leaders, will look like. But then BAM also adds something known as plugins, which enables application controlled execution. So like the default ordering is by priority fee and CU, but the end goal is to have application controlled execution, which can unlock use cases that haven't been seen before in the Solana ecosystem, such as prioritizing cancels, for instance, for market makers, or doing a bunch of cool stuff that would theoretically enable things like perps, enable things like dark pools, etc. So that's the core idea with BAM. And right now, BAM, it's important to know that it's closed source. So it's still not like a full functionality in terms of like the attestation. But the goal for the team is to open sources in the coming months. so that it becomes as transparent as possible. And also plugins are really in an early stage today. So you haven't really seen like application controlled sequencing like take off, but that is also something that we are looking into for the coming months.
And then to follow that up, so when we compare how BAM operates compared to what we know about Harmonic, I guess, can you walk through like what are the sort of known differences there?
Yeah, I can go into that. So with Harmonic is essentially an aggregation layer that sits on top of multiple block builders. So when a validator is running Harmonic, Harmonic essentially collects a bunch of blocks. And then this essentially allows the validator, based on their preferences, to pick which block they essentially want, whether it be maximizing revenue, whether it be minimizing toxic MEV exposure, or any type of application-specific sequencing. Is essentially up to the validator. So Harmonic believes like this is the best way to do it per se. And I would say that at the moment, it is also closed sourced. So it's hard to tell exactly what is going on. And that at the moment there is essentially Temporal has 3 block builders that are being submitted into Harmonic. So it is all still essentially done by Temporal. But the plan here is to eventually open up the Harmonic process so any third party can actually submit their blocks as well. So that's what I would say would be the key distinction here, is it is essentially trying to create a marketplace for block building.
And then what are sort of the downstream impacts of the two approaches here? Like me as a user performing transactions on Solana, like how am I affected? Or an application that, has to operate and push transactions to users.
So we can look at different metrics, right? So when we look at like one of the reasons this is such a complex topic is that no one has actually defined what optimal block building looks like. Jito has tried to put out a definition of what optimal block building is for a streaming chain like Solana. So how Jito defines optimal block building is basically you need to stream non-BOW transactions continuously, which means that if you look at like the block you can divide it in like 64 ticks. And what you should like ideally look at is like transactions being more or less uniformly submitted across the block, right? So as people submit transactions, you kind of confirming those transactions as threads within the block, right? What happens in practice is that some validators don't actually submit those transactions like uniformly across the block, but they actually submit the majority of transactions at the end of the slot. So if you look at the 64 ticks, then maybe the majority of transactions are crammed into the 60 tick, right? And what that does is that it undermines Solana's streaming design, and you can have like real-time markets that way. Because imagine if you're a market maker and you're at tick, I don't know, 5, but you submit that transaction and it doesn't get confirmed and it doesn't get sent as a shred, then you are risking being picked off by a toxic taker if that gets submitted like at the end of the block, if that makes sense. So that is like one lens you can look at that way. And one of the reasons this has been so controversial is because if you look at BAM blocks, on average, they actually show this like uniformly distributed like non-BOW transactions. Whereas if you look at like Frankendancer RevStrat blocks, or if you look at some of the Harmonic blocks, you'll see that transactions are crammed at the end of the slot when they are confirmed. And here we go into like much more complex questions of like, are they reordering transactions? Like, are they censoring some market makers? Like, is MEV being maximized here? Because if you crammed at the end of the slot, you essentially have more time to look and to have like a last mover advantage as a leader to insert or reorder transactions to maximize like rewards. And what that causes in practice is that market makers, because they see that the leader has like a monopoly over ordering, what they do is they just wait until the end of the slot to maybe include updates, or maybe they widen their quotes because they don't want to get picked off. So for users, what that means is they have like worse execution in essence. So that's one lens you can look at it. Other lens you can look at it is you can look at it by prop AMMs, because prop AMMs are so dominant in Solana's trading landscape. So you can do some prop AMM metrics. For instance, we can look at Oracle update win rates. So we can define a win rate here as who is the, like within the prop AMMs, like who was the first to update their oracles within a certain validator client slot. So for instance, in a Jito BAM slot, like who was the first prop AMM to land a transaction to update their oracle quotes, if that makes sense. That's another way to look at it. So in this chart here, we see that for the first 2 weeks of the year, Humidify had a much higher oracle win rate under Harmonic than under other validator clients. And transaction ordering is really important for prop AMMs, because they have a race to update quotes as fast as possible to avoid being picked up and have the most updated or fresh information, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think this makes a lot of sense. So you covered a few things. One is the distribution of packing within a block throughout shreds. And I think, of course, that was the IBRL dashboard put out by Jito. They kind of built that and publicized it to basically highlight that issue, distribution of kind of how blocks are being built. And then on the other side, I think this captures the point that you were just mentioning. Somewhere in the middle, though, we were talking about, I want to go back to some data, because there has been some conversation around consumer applications specifically, and one that's been called out is Axiom. When you talked a little bit about how this might affect fees or how much users basically pay to transact. And you had this data here around Axiom versus network priority fees. I guess, can you speak to this point again, versus maybe more distributive packing throughout a block kind of impacts sort of the market structure that ends up happening here in terms of fees paid by users?
Yeah.
So yeah, basically, some of this data we got from Benedict Brady, and you can clearly see for essentially retail users on much smaller transaction counts, the network fee is orders of magnitude larger. And this is where you start thinking about like possible like side deals, vertical integration concerns with a front-end interface, and how that translates all the way from block building to transaction landing services to the prop AMM themselves. So obviously, if something like this is happening and these deals are being done, that is not the optimal environment that Solana would want to have for retail users. So that was another essentially key thing we wanted to look at in regards to essentially how we came to our conclusion on our preference for the correct market structure going forward.
And maybe it would be great. I want to get to sort of the conclusions and how we're thinking about like what's the right approach going forward, or how does Solana solve this? I think that's probably the underlying fundamental question here. But before we do that, I guess there is some, you have some data on the breakdown of different clients and how they perform under some of these metrics. So maybe we can walk through some of that and sort of compare like what we saw in terms of comparisons of performance.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something first, which is like, if you think like a lot of the like issues or controversy from this stems from the fact that the temporal team essentially runs 3 services, which you can argue are sort of vertically integrated and gives way for like a conflict in terms of the incentives. So temporal has, as we mentioned, Harmonic, which is like this block building solution that's competing against Jito, but it also runs Humidify, which is a prop AMM, and it also runs Nozomi, which is a transaction landing service. So if they own these 3 parts of the stack, you can imagine that incentives are sort of like biased toward like, I don't want to say being malicious, but they can maybe benefit, like Humidify can benefit from Nozomi, and they can also benefit from the way that Harmonic like orders blocks, if that makes sense, to have like the freshest price information and to have better markouts than the rest of prop AMMs. I'm not saying this happens. It's just like these are the concerns that people have, right? And so a lot of this data is kind of not trying to prove that, but trying to like bring light into what is actually happening, and if Harmonic is actually seeing this vertical integration dynamics actually show up in the data. And I really wanted to clarify this because it's important to like set the context as to why this has been so controversial. And because I also talked about earlier about the Oracle win rates, I should clarify that that was for the first 2 weeks of the year. This may have changed since then, right? So it's important to take that with a grain of salt. Because back then Harmonic had like 3 to 4% stake. They now have close to 16% of stake. So it may have changed since then in the sense that it's more like normalized, right? So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that.
I think that's a good point to bring up. And I mean, and maybe there is a point to sort of steelman their point of view as well. Kind of examining the Jito side from a neutral position is that, you know, I think if you look back at the prior sort of Solana landscape, you could maybe make the argument that, you know, Jito makes a lot of money from Jito tips. They have an effective monopoly on the block building kind of landscape. And probably at that point in time, now that things have shifted, you know, it's not so strongly in one way or the other. But at that point in time, maybe you could have made that argument of, you know, they're sort of unfairly benefiting from something that maybe should just be captured natively by the Solana protocol and is not, and they're just, you know, they're benefiting from that. It seems like the core of this argument kind of maybe comes down to really a friction over that same topic of there is something that could be clarified by Solana natively that is not, and then therefore these teams kind of have to they get to fight over it for market share. I think that's great context there, Carlos. And let's follow up that context then with some of the data that you collected, and just talk about that performance before chatting kind of like final thoughts.
Yeah, I'd say firstly, so when we looked at like IBRL scores, so the one where Harmonic gets hits the hardest is by non-vote packing, which we discussed a bit earlier. Which you can see in one of the graphs, is like the main reason the aggregate score so much lower. But obviously it's important to note that IBRL is by Jito themselves. So Harmonic do push heavily against that. And also onto another slide where we talk about block build times, BAM versus Harmonic. So we can see that Harmonic blocks block build times have been pushing well above 400 milliseconds from the data we saw in Epoch 909 to 919. So whether you attribute to this to the actual auction process themselves, which is what they would argue, or whether this is some type of late packing technique, that's where the big controversy hits. But then recently there's been some discussions that some of this data that was collected before February this year, essentially the data, Harmonic is arguing some of the data is somewhat glitchy in a sense, and that it wasn't accurately measuring what was happening. And there's some validity to this because we can see since Epoch like 920, 921, that their block times have gone down to almost 400 milliseconds now. So this is something definitely to take into account. But that being said, there is still around a 50 millisecond gap between Harmonic and BAM at the moment. And I guess our personal view is that essentially any approach that trades block speed for essentially higher per slot revenue would be moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting data. I actually want to go back one, and I'm curious. So I think just from my understanding of the conversation and around block packing, like my assumption from that would be that, basically late packing your blocks would maybe have a downstream effect, and then maybe your median build block, block build time would be a bit longer than if you were streaming throughout the block. Maybe it's that. Maybe there's some other things factored in. Maybe Harmonic has some other things to say as well. I'm curious as well, though, by this range offered up by the Frankendancer clients. Like, they're obviously not in this sort of like battle, and yet they have like a very wide tails of their distribution here, and some even quite lower than the median presented by like Jito, BAM, Agave, and Harmonic. I don't know if you guys dug much into that data, or if what Frankendancer is doing quite differently from these other clients to enable such like a wide spread of block build times. But it is interesting to see both of them and Harmonic have quite a wide spread, but theirs to be like quite below the low end for every other builder.
Yeah, I'd say so the data from Frankendancer, I guess there are Frankendancer like RevStrat on clients, and essentially that is essentially having an optimal packing approach at the end of the block in order to maximize rev per se. So that's what I would attribute seeing that the Q1 to Q3 in the data there stretching to the 400 millisecond mark. I'd say I wouldn't read too much into how low it gets per se. I would focus on the Q1 to Q3 distribution. But obviously, depending on what a validator is essentially doing with a Frankendancer client, it allows, I would say it allows them to have a much more varying approach. Whereas if someone is running Jito BAM, what they can essentially do is a lot more constrained, which Jito would be arguing is for the better of the network.
Yeah, there's also this argument that, as Sam was saying, that the longer the build time, the more transactions you can include within the block, the more CUs you can include, and therefore that's why you see the higher fees per block with some validators. It's important to know that Harmonic like disputes these claims, and they argue that their higher fees per block are not attributed to slot lagging or higher build times, but are actually because they claim they pack blocks more efficiently, because they have like 3 builders, and those 3 builders compete to who can like win the auction and win the block subsequently, right? So it is important to also give their side of the argument there. What I would point to is that as of today, Harmonic is closed source, so you cannot like verify this with any open data, but it is like actually important to bring up this point.
It's a great call out here in terms of the data, like, and you also present, median block fee by block build time, but then also if I jump over to median CUs by block build time. So I guess to some extent that, the data might explain some of that relationship as you're saying. But yeah, ultimately there is a question of, if we can't necessarily verify how the system works kind of end to end, all the nitty gritty, then you do have to have some, in markets we'd say you'd put a little bit of a discount factor into that until they open source it, which I don't know if they have plans to do, or get some more concrete information on it. I guess where does this lead us then, in terms of, I know Sam, you mentioned some things here. I'll pull the data off the screen. You did mention the point here that drifting away from evenly distributed blocks and just streaming as fast as possible data to the chain, and more towards sort of like economic optimization of a block's value or fees is sort of the less ideal outcome for Solana. I guess my question would be, and I think we've talked about some of the sort of potential future solutions to this, is what does Solana need to do here to kind of resolve this tension?
Yeah, so I'd say, in our personal opinion, having this process essentially a lot more centralized and having a centralized actor determine what is optimal for the network would be the best process, rather than having not only Jito versus Harmonic, but also you're having Harmonic's internal block builders compete. As our personal view is that consistency will be the most important thing in getting spreads tighter and having the optimal environment for applications to build on, per se. And that leads into what Solana is doing with working with ANSA, with MCP. And yeah, in my personal opinion, that would be the most optimal thing for the network. However, when looking at what Jito, BAM, and Harmonic are doing at the moment, you could argue that it essentially puts those exact business models out of business, per se. So that's like the number one thing we'd be looking at. But our view would be that an in-protocol solution like MCP would be the best thing to do. I don't know if, Carlos, you have anything more to go off that?
Yeah, so if you think about like Solana's transaction supply chain, the issue is not just block building, right? Like if you think about block building, you have like Jito and Harmonic today, right? Like potentially in the future, you have other solutions like Raiku. You have like multiple clients, right? You have like Agave, and then you have Frankendancer and Firedancer, right? But it doesn't stop there, right? So if you think about fee markets, for instance, you have base fees, you have priority fees, which are kind of in protocol, but then you also have out of protocol like Jito tips. That also adds complexity to the market maker, because when they have to think about like their cost to update stuff, they don't have to think just about like what are the fees that I need to include in the TPU, like for Solana itself. They also need to think about what are the tips that I need to give to external like services such as Jito, like to include like my Oracle updates. That's just one example. And on top of that, you don't have like just one TPU, which is a Solana like transaction processing unit. You have multiple transaction landing services such as Nosami, CRX Lot, Helios, etc., that you need to like also take into account, like to land transactions faster, because at the end of the day, Solana competes on latency, and you need to be like really fast if you want to be competitive as a prop AMM or as a like real-time application like a PerpsDex or whatever it may be. So a lot of the issues that Solana has today essentially stem from limitations that the L1 had like 2 years ago, 1 year ago, and then just as a natural consequences, third-party providers like emerge to kind of address those limitations and provide solutions to those issues. The problem is that now you have sort of like this Frankenstein of like multiple things here, multiple things there, and like as an external application, as an external like trading firm, it's really hard to navigate that landscape, especially if you're like new to the Solana ecosystem. And if Solana wants to attract like new builders and new applications, they really need to simplify it in the same way that Hyperliquid, like for instance, in Hyperliquid, we've heard that for a market maker, it can take as little as a day to set up like their account or whatever they may need to be more quoting there, right? For Solana, that is simply not the case, because it is so complex to spin up like the necessary infrastructure and expertise to be able to be competitive in that landscape. And so a lot of like the reason that we're emphasizing that MCP is the only credible solution in the long term is because it essentially simplifies the stack, and it gives like more consistent rules of the game for everyone, right? It gives censorship resistance. It gives consistent transaction sequencing rules, and importantly, you have that within like every slot. So today you're saying like which is the better block building approach? Like what we're seeing with NCP is which is the more consistent block building approach, right? So you're going not just from bad to better, you're going to least consistent to more consistent blocks and rules of the game for everyone.
And yeah, just to add on that, like say for example, if you believe like BAM is the optimal block building environment before we reach an MCP state, the problem is like for BAM to actually attract enough stake to be a majority or get to 80-90%, now that we have these competitive dynamics is like pretty much, you could argue, is impossible. And I would say, even though applications or market makers can tell ahead of time which block is going to be the leader, there's definitely like synergistic effects in having block after block consistently having the same environment, rather than the current approach of this leader-based system. So that's definitely something to highlight, that you could argue, like, obviously Jito and the Jito BAM team, very smart. They could be thinking of things that might even be better than what MCP is doing. But because it is not an in-protocol solution, for them to actually attract the entire network stake or enough to have these fully synergistic effects is pretty much impossible. And so that would be one of our main concerns.
Yeah, I like that. I think it makes a lot of sense. Great call outs from both of you. I think what maybe we should dig into is, and we have some great couple of diagrams here, is like, talk me through, Carlos, you mentioned MCP really just simplifies this entire kind of flow that today is kind of filled with third parties essentially, and not filled with Solana native protocol. So let's talk through that. Like, how exactly does MCP simplify if we just sort of look at the process? I know we have a little flow diagram here of some initial sort of from Alpenglow rollout to then Supernova Part 1 and getting to full MCP.
Yeah, so essentially, like, we should clarify, like, the core requirement for multiple concurrent proposers to be implemented is Alpenglow going live. As far as we understand, Alpenglow is being targeted for August of this year. So after Alpenglow gets released, it will be like another, I don't know, 6 to 12 months to see MCP go live. But essentially, this shows the turbine the diagram flow under single leader versus under MCP. And the core differences is that today, as you can see here, these little boxes are all validators. They are just being chosen to represent a different role in the transaction supply chain within that slot. So first you have like the clients. Those clients send transactions to the leader under Alpenglow. Under MCP, they will send it to multiple concurrent proposers instead. These entities send shreds, which are small packets of data. So each block is broken down into multiple shreds, 64 to be precise. And these are being sent to relays. And relays essentially send these shreds to the validator, right? The problem is that today the leader gets a monopoly on their transaction sequencing. So we get a lot of the issues we were telling earlier, like the leader can choose to censor some transactions. They can choose to withhold some transactions and reorder the block. And that gives rise to delay packing issues and like the MEV concerns that we were talking about earlier. Whereas with the Supernova Part 1, which is going to implement MCP, the relay still sends the shreds to the validator, but at the same time, they send an attestation to the leader. And this attestation gets aggregated by multiple validators. So essentially, the leader cannot cheat essentially and censor some transactions because they need to account for every validator attestation, and that is public to everyone, so everyone would know essentially if you are withholding some transactions or behaving maliciously in a way. So this addresses the block building side. I want to be clear, this does not address like the transaction landing services. It does not address like the priority fees versus Jito tips, etc. But these are things that are also getting resolved down the line with different updates. For instance, Danny, I know we've discussed in the past about like a Solana REV essentially favoring priority fees over Jito tips. I think this is a trend that we'll continue to see shape out. And in Jito's last token holder call, they even mentioned that over time, like they expect to wind down Jito tips and just like keep priority fees as the only mechanism for transaction inclusion.
I think that makes a ton of sense. Like you said, this sort of explains that one part. I guess the other side of the coin that I'm thinking about personally is I have to imagine you still need to solve sort of some logic, right, in determining rules for how certain transactions might be handled, right? If there's different ways that you could, order and merge together different sets of transactions, I'm assuming you'd have to kind of beforehand set some rules for how they would be handled. How deeply is Solana thinking about that today? Do we have some clear kind of logic already, or is that like actively being debated at the moment?
So it would be like first come, first serve, but then if there are conflicting transactions, it's essentially like a priority fee per CU. So that is the ordering rule. We actually have like I don't know if we included that diagram in the slides, but the transaction ordering logic is priority fee per CU. So essentially the merge rule is you collect all transactions from all proposers, you remove the duplicates and keep the highest fee, and then sort by priority fee. That would be like the first iteration of MCP. But that consistency, that knowing the rules of the game of how transactions are ordered actually helps a lot to improve market structure.
And that's the main stipulation, right? Today, it can be a different rule set every single block, hypothetically, and so you might have to have multiple sets of logic, or maybe you don't submit to some blocks, but you submit to others. But hypothetically, in the future, you could just sort of have one kind of operating code that you follow, and you submit your blocks following the same sort of, or you submit your transactions following the same procedure every single time, and that would be sort of the our perceived ideal outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I don't know, Sam, if you want to talk about this, but like the end game for Solana, I think is application controlled execution. And so this is just a first iteration. I think applications and market makers have expressed like interest in eventually having more control over sequencing. Although this is a great first step to achieve that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ACE is like the key thing here, in my opinion. And if you can have an ACE solution that is essentially in protocol, that everyone knows is going to be exactly the same every single time. In my opinion, that'll be the best environment for market makers to eventually have the tighter spreads. It'll be the best environment for apps to develop on. And if they can implement that effectively, that should be a catalyst for Solana applications and the broader ecosystem.
That does seem to be one of the other, like if we think about back to the perpetuals question, that seems to be a kind of a hinge point right now in terms of the, the protocols that have been building, trying to make sort of the next gen of perps on Solana. A lot of them have taken these approaches where they are doing either a single sequencer or like running some sidecar process on a set of validators, such that they're just avoiding native Solana so that they can do custom execution. But yeah, offering that natively would basically be the solution to those teams looking to kind of build out something more custom and performant, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess like even originally with Phoenix's session limit order book many like a couple years ago now, the fact like that they never took off, I feel like was like the best signal that Solana had these microstructure problems, and that was confirmed by perps not working as well. So yeah, I do see this as probably like the most important thing for Solana, or I guess any monolithic chain, to make sure they get correct.
Then talk me through, I'm just curious what your guys' thoughts are, the research team's thoughts then are on, there's sort of, it seems like there's almost like a wall or like a singularity here where today there's a lot of business models, right? There's Jito, there's Harmonic, there's others doing block building, there's transaction lending services, there's a variety of these things. But if the goal and really the ideal ends or future state for Solana is to sort of basically in-house a bunch of the stuff, basically by kind of encoding it into the protocol, do we see like a collapse of these businesses, or are there ways for them to kind of like insert themselves into, you'll think they'll find kind of parts in this new construction that they can fit into and monetize?
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, particularly Jito have voiced publicly. I mean, they're obviously aware of what is happening. They're very smart people. Um, but they publicly said like they are looking at other ways that they can assist this Solana ecosystem. They haven't said anything too specifically. Correct me if I'm wrong, Carlos, but I do believe they're well aware of what is happening. And they're going to continue to innovate and make changes and come up with different services, even in this MCP world. So I would say at the moment, when you look at like Jito BAM's and Harmonic's essentially business model, you could be quite skeptical depending on your timeline for something like MCP to actually be integrated properly. But they're obviously aware of this. So it's like a known type of risk. And you could also argue shipping Alpenglow, shipping MCP, like these things always take much longer than expected. So you could argue like a lot can happen in 1 to 2 years in crypto. So there's a lot of opportunity there to improve the microstructure, make money in the process. So it's definitely something to be to notice, but I wouldn't be too concerned for these teams as they're well aware.
Yeah, I think Sam made a great point, like especially like with regards to the timelines. Like if MCP is like 12 to 18 months away still, like Solana can't afford to have the same problems with market structure for that long. Otherwise, like maybe the lead that other apps like Hyperliquid with Perps have gets so big that they can't come back from it. So I do think like it is sort of like this urgent problem, like the ecosystem needs to address, and whether it is BAM, whether it is Harmonic, like it needs to be solved today, not 18 months from now. And so I think like even though like MCP is probably going to get implemented, there's also a question of what happens in the meantime, right? And so I think like these teams can add a lot of value if they collaborate, they work together like today to help the ecosystem like strive forward. And then after MCP goes live, then yeah, like with their current business model, like it is unclear how they fit into that world. They will probably need to figure out how to provide other services on top of it, or maybe like completely like rethink like their business models.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I think you make a great point here on just, there's always some path dependency involved in these things. And of course the timelines do matter. They always matter, especially in terms of, kind of who ends up coming out on top. Sometimes you can be early and then therefore wrong. Sometimes you can be late and therefore, kind of miss out on all the action. And being there in the uncomfortable middle is actually oftentimes where sort of winners end up emerging. It will be interesting to see, like, I think maybe a point worth re-highlighting is the fact that you have teams like Bulk and Bullet launching to like today or recently or soon in some cases, with constructions that sort of don't fit that future layout of MCP, with custom execution logic natively on the protocol. They're just going to build how they need to build, either through signal sequencer or sidecar processor, and they could hypothetically be very successful and win out. And maybe all of the like additional upgrades to Solana that come after aren't even necessary for them, so to speak. And if someone waits around for that to happen and then build, via the native solution, they may have already lost. So I think it's a great point. Like a lot of things can happen, and we could see that sort of the uncomfortable or like sort of uncertain builders today might be the like dominant winners in the future.
Yeah, like all these exchanges are essentially just trying to bypass Solana's transaction queue uh, by different architectures, but that's essentially what they're trying to do. I am actually confident that Solana will get this resolved, like as a community. And then I do think that Perps dexes on the L1 will probably do much better than these architectures that are like being done like bypassing the public transaction queue. I do remain confident that for instance Phoenix Perps, which is using like prop AMM architecture, that's doing like really innovative stuff on that front, will probably see a lot of traction and caught a lot of people by surprise. That's maybe a bit of a contrarian opinion. I do think like these issues will get resolved.
Yeah, and like seconding that, like if you do believe in a monolithic vision, like there are composability benefits to everything being done within the single chain. So if they can get this right, I believe that will further accelerate Solana's lead compared to any other monolithic player. And yeah, seeing someone like Ellipsis Labs decide to build on Solana with their Perp exchange, I feel like is a really good information point and indicator of what's to come.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting spot to watch. Of course, there's the Jito Harmonic battle, but for all of these new perps products, I mean, there's several teams like kind of launching here in Q1 or Q2, seeing this difference between natively on Solana versus like a sort of out of protocol solution. It will be interesting to see who gains traction and for what reasons. And so maybe that native composability will win out. Maybe it won't. I'm curious to see what happens there personally, having chatted with a lot of those teams. But I like the viewpoint there, Carlos. Maybe for one last light question for you guys before we close out is timeline for Alpenglow plus MCP. And you're talking about 12 to 18 months out. If you just had to pick, like, would you be bullish and think that they're going to sort of beat that timeline, get it to market faster? Or would you actually have the kind of standard expectation that it takes much longer? I think that's kind of what we're used to in crypto.
I think I'm gonna be optimistic and say that Alpenglow ships in August or Q3 by the end of Q3 of 2026, and I'm gonna say that MCP ships by Q3 of 2027.
Yeah, I'd say pretty similar just because of how important it is and everyone is aware of it. That being said, like when you look at how long it took other clients like Fidancer per se, it always seems much longer. So I'd say I would agree on the timelines they're communicating. I wouldn't say I'd find it harder to be quicker than that, but I'd agree that they'll achieve it in the timelines they're communicating because of how important it is.
Yeah, the other thing to keep in mind is that like ANSA team has been shipping a lot lately, and they are the ones that will be shipping like MCP. So I do think they'll get it done.
Great thoughts. We'll have to see if I guess sort of the outside variable is if AI sort of really accelerates workflows and maybe you can speed up dev processes by another shave 6 months off a 12-month kind of workflow loop. TBD, but anyone watching the space knows that those tools have been advancing quite quickly. So in another 6 months, I mean, who knows how effective those will be for developers, but certainly from like a year ago to today, there's been quite a market improvement there. So I think that'll be interesting as well to see how that impacts kind of like, I don't know. I agree with your like general skepticism here, Sam, around developer timelines, at least in crypto. Like we've seen at least, Ethereum and L2s on that side of thing on certain constructions there. It's like, oh, we're going to get to a certain construction within 3 years, and then it takes 5, and then it takes 7, and then maybe it never happens. So that's kind of been something that's been painful for those of us within the industry to see timelines get pushed and pushed and pushed. So hopefully that's not the case in this scenario. I would agree, Carlos. It feels like Anza really got kind of a kick in the pants within the last year or so and just started like shipping and posting and being a lot more aggressive in their discussion of kind of timelines and things that they want to get out, and the client itself. Whether that was led by Fidancer getting closer to market and them wanting to kick it into high gear, or a combination of factors. Either way, I think it's been good overall for Solana. But we can close it out there, gentlemen. I think that was a great conversation. I was really glad to have you both on to talk about block building. This should be a really interesting report for those that take the time to read through it and take back a look at all the data. It'll be available on that Solana Lightspeed IR platform, which will be live by the time this episode is out. So certainly go and take a look if you have access there. And otherwise, I'll do one last shout out. I'm excited to see both of you in person again at DAS in New York, March 24th through the 26th. Get $200 off tickets. Use code Lightspeed200. We'd love to see you there and chat. If you want to chat about block building with Sam or Carlos, certainly come out and give them a chat. But also some of the folks within the space will have, Solana Foundation, Solana Policy Institute, and then plenty of other like teams within the Solana ecosystem will of course be there as well. So a ton of great folks to chat with, as well as other sort of industry giants. So that'll be a great conference. We'll all be there. We'd love to see you and chat with you. But once again, Sam, Carlos, thanks again for coming on today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Danny.
Cheers.
All right. Until next time, guys.